Andrew Critchlow, it's 4th of April. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you, Ali. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, listen,
pleasure to have you with us.
London is still a bit cold, and nothing is more important than the topic of energy and keeping warm. And with everything that is happening around the world, Andy, we'd like to tap into your insight and guidance today as to what are the latest developments, these tectonic shifts, the latest crises are going to affect us during this podcast and session together. But at the same time, I wanted to ask you, are we going into a post-traumatic net zero disorder? Is this the end of net zero, and how is that affecting, the renewables as such? Because all of a sudden, oil and gas are at the top of the agenda for energy security. Where do you see that going?
It's a great question, and I think what's happening in energy markets at the moment is they're being pulled in two ways, and certainly energy transition is still a very big magnetic force pulling energy markets in a certain direction. And to a greater extent, what's happened around energy security and the situation in Ukraine and the questions that raises over the dependency of some major consuming nations on Russian oil and gas feeds into this. But it also pulls in the opposite direction, because it's amplified the awareness of everyone, really, of how important fossil fuels still are to the global economy. And, whenever I'm asked this question, I kind of put it in the context of people and the amount of people on the planet. We live in a world of about 6 billion people, going to 9 billion by 2050. And these are UN estimates. And what does that mean? Well, it means the world is going to need more energy. It's going to need more commodities. Everything that is produced from raw materials, such as metals, such as ores, grains, basic agricultural products, it all needs energy to produce. It needs fuel to power the tractors. It needs energy to take the goods and services from the factory to the port to the consumer. And the big challenge is, how do we meet this global energy requirement through to 2050 that is going to increase as a consequence of global population? That is a constant, without destroying the planet, by preventing further climate change, by making a fair and more equitable settlement than we've seen previously in the production, distribution, sale of fossil fuels. And energy transition is absolutely critically important to that story. And then on the other side of that, you have where we are today: oil prices above $100 a barrel, gas prices which have quintupled in value in the last 6 months, primarily due to geostrategic concerns. And how do you still provide the investment that's going to be required to move to energy transition, to develop a new energy source like hydrogen, to develop solar, to develop wind, and still keep the lights on? And many of the energy security issues that have arisen from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that are very evident in the Middle East, whether it's to do with attacks on physical infrastructure that you're seeing now, are all kind of indicative of a market that's very hot. Supply-demand balances are very tight. And the kind of bumpy transition that we all knew was going to happen as part of energy transition, that becomes amplified. But I think history has some important lessons in this regard. When you walk back to 2008, when you had oil prices at the historic record of $147 a barrel, what was the outcome of that? Was really the beginnings of this debate. And in fact, it actually started a few years earlier. The beginnings of this debate seriously about energy transition. And this isn't the first time that we've talked about policies to reduce fossil fuel consumption. You wind back all the way back to the Arab oil embargo of the early 1970s. the constraints on supply that came from the Iranian Revolution in 1979 through to the heights of the tanker war in 1983-84. You had policies in the US to restrict speed on roads to reduce consumption. You had policies to encourage vehicle manufacturers to make smaller capacity vehicles, again, to reduce consumption. You had legislation globally in major consuming nations to reduce fossil fuel consumption, because it was people were aware that economies can't thrive and grow to the speed that is required when you have these high oil prices. Yet in the Middle East, you still have major petrodollar states, for want of a better description, that require oil prices at least above $80 a barrel, and in some cases higher than that to sustain their economic growth, to balance their budgets. So again, competing interests. But if we now wind that back forward, we're actually in a very similar position to kind of where we were actually in the 1970s, because you have this high oil price environment. The West, the traditional major oil consuming nations of the West, Europe, North America, the economies cannot function as efficiently as at $100 plus as they could when we're in the $50 range. And then the impact that higher oil prices, higher energy prices has on Asia, again, is equally as profound. And so you come to the conclusion, are we going to actually see a faster energy transition? Although a lot of the rhetoric that we see now, especially here in the UK, is around, well, we need more energy security to provide that. We need to drill more. We need to redevelop the North Sea. We need to frack. We need to find new resources. Actually, if you look at the strategic direction of the government, and probably what they're planning to announce this week in terms of a long-term energy strategy, they're going to double down on energy transition. They're going to double down on clean energy. They are and seem to be very committed to reducing their dependence on fossil fuels. And this has a big impact on politics. It has a big impact on international relations, on the relations that the US, that Europe, that countries like the UK, which have traditionally been very close to some of the Gulf states, it has a major impact on that relationship going forward. Then on the other side of that, you have 60% of the Middle East oil heading to China and India. Asia is a major market. That's only going to increase.
Very interesting. I just have a quick follow-up to that, and I'm sure Anush is going to jump in a second. With this windfall of this new profitability for oil and gas, big IOCs, do you see a JP Morgan moment at the moment that, Jamie Dimon has given a full throttle to buying fintech companies? Do you see the IOCs coming and, like Pac-Man eating all of these little, or smaller renewable companies in this direction, Andy?
And I don't see the IOCs doing that. I think international oil companies, I think that they are at a crossroads, certainly. And I think the energy transition has brought them to that crossroads. But I also think the geopolitics of the stakeholders has changed what is possible for international oil companies. If you look at globally where the world's largest reserves are still available to tap, we're talking really about the Middle East. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, the Gulf. You're talking about Iran, Iraq. If you wind back to 2015, when we had the last sanctions relief with Iran, international oil majors were very quick to open representative offices again in Tehran. That's because Iran's upstream reserves still hold vast potential. It's not just oil; it's gas held in South Pars. Obviously, Iran shares the North Field in the Persian Gulf with Qatar, the world's largest single gas asset. When you look at an international gas market which is strained, and the location of these resources right in the center of the world, bridging the two markets, easy to transport, both west of Suez and to the east into Asia, accessing those resources is critical. But the IOCs, for them, it's very difficult. And we've seen that from, in the wake of 2003 and international oil companies, their experience of Iraq, where you had the prospect that Iraq was going to be a Klondike for international oil companies. Actually, it didn't quite turn out that way. If you look at previous attempts of some Gulf states to open up their upstream, Saudi Arabia, for example, the gas initiative, which started in 2001, it was a failure. And it took a decade for that to kind of become realized. And the international companies that were involved in that, they lost a lot of money looking for gas in the desert that wasn't actually there. And the commercial terms that were offered weren't exactly favorable. That's not the case everywhere. So Qatar, for example, they've partnered historically with international oil companies to develop their LNG very successfully. And they, again, looking to do that in the future. Abu Dhabi, the same. Oman, the same. But the experience is mixed. I think that IOCs on the whole are more focused on re-gearing their balance sheets and their businesses to focus on energy transition. So it's developing hydrogen, it's developing solar, it's to power the passenger transport of the future, which is going to be electric vehicles.
But Andy, I was talking about them buying startups in renewables, but we'll park that and we'll come to it. I know.
Well, I think that on that point, I think what you may see more of in the future is national companies, specifically the ones in the Middle East, which have large balance sheets. In some cases, they're supported by significant sovereign wealth fund assets, and whether it's those IOCs going and buying these startup energy transition firms, or it's actually the sovereign wealth funds doing it, I think you will see a lot more of that, because for them, it's about diversifying your portfolio. And the major oil producing states of the region, they don't want to give up their quite envious position of being in control of so much of the world's energy resources so quickly. They want to hedge for the future so that when we get to 2050 and you have all these major consuming nations, if they're good to their word, having economies which are net zero, that these countries aren't bankrupt and completely dependent on their sovereign wealth funds.
On that note, Andy, and following up from what you've just been saying, I'm very conscious that, of course, today we're going to receive the latest Intergovernmental Climate Change report coming out, delayed from last week, but it's due at some point today. And it's going to read, I think it's going to be very kind of bad reading for the major exporters or producers, even for that matter, because it seems to be wanting to press much harder on the search for renewables and decarbonization as best the world can do. So these, and yet you've got, as you've said in response to Ali's question, you've got, the world clamoring for whatever hydrocarbons are out there right now. Do you see that tension being managed going forward, or are we now in a kind of a, don't look down the alley of decarbonization just now? Although I take your point about the British government's policy, but I want to press you on continental Europe that we can do a bit later. But how much flexibility do the global north have? And secondly, what does the global south do? And thirdly, what about these guys who are dependent, who built their own economies on extraction of hydrocarbons? None of these reports seems to say, but we've got a plan for you guys. All it seems to say is, well, we're going to turn the tap off. Thank you very much and good night.
I think it's a great question. I kind of start with the final question. There's three questions. I'll start with the final one. World oil demand, according to S&P Global Commodity Insights projections for 2022, is we're going to be still just a little bit under pre-COVID levels, about 101 million barrels a day of demand. You wind back to pre-COVID 2019, globally we were on track to consume about 102 million barrels a day of oil. Most estimates would still say that by 2030, 2040, that sort of range, the world is going to need between 110, 112 million barrels a day of crude. So we go back to this original argument. and the point around population growth and how you provide all the resources that demand energy to produce them to meet that. So, the report that's coming out today, although very significant, you can't get away from that figure, and it's that gap. It's that 8 to 10 million barrel a day gap where you aren't seeing the investment going into the energy industry to produce that new oil. And that gap is widening because the stakeholders, the national oil companies, the governments that still control 60% of the world's reserves, they are becoming more reticent to actually invest themselves, although they have the capital. So instead of actually investing in oil field development themselves or going to IOCs, because the IOCs don't really want to invest unless they can get more preferential terms. The governments don't want to give them more preferential terms because that means giving away revenue. So they go to capital market, they go to debt markets to raise this cash. They have to pay more for that because the debt markets now attach a very big premium for this. A lot of banks don't want to lend for upstream oil and gas projects anymore. So until you see that cycle broken, where we have reached peak oil and we're not there yet, then it's going to take a tremendous amount of political will to change people's consumption of energy and how they do it. And you see this, this is at grassroots level. And oil is still profoundly political because it shifts voter opinion. And you're seeing that now in the US, the profound nervousness of the administration around gasoline prices and how it's really driving policy in so many ways, not necessarily in a positive way, because it's never strategic. It's always short term. It's always actually chasing the next vote. In this case, it's midterms, which come at the end of the year. Historically, US presidents haven't done very well when they've had to release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which the government over there has recently had to do, to quell gasoline prices. That link hasn't actually changed at this point. So to change that, there's two things that governments can do. They can tax more. And when you talk to institutions like OPEC and ministers in OPEC, and you say, well, oil prices are too high, you have to pump more oil, why are you not doing this? They will say, talk to the consumers, because it's the tax. Look at the taxation rates on every on every gallon of refined product, whether that's diesel, petrol, gasoline, whatever you call it. It's the tax that makes fuel expensive, and they have a point. But this is the paradox for the governments that are trying to move to net zero quicker, that are trying to shift away from fossil fuels. Really, the only way they can do it is by imposing these sin taxes, draconian taxes, which will stop consumers using more hydrocarbons and incentivize them to shift to low carbon alternatives, whether that's EVs for passenger transport, whether that's installing heat pumps, solar panels. It all comes with a cost. You have to provide the incentive. It's push and pull. You have to provide the incentive, but you also have to, provide the stick, which is taxation. Is there the political will to do that? I don't necessarily see it, because in many ways, the governments that need to introduce these policies are fragile at the moment in many ways. So it's difficult. I don't know if I answered the question there.
You've gone some way to answering it. What about the producers side of the story? Many are trying to move their economies away from hydrocarbons production and so on, but these are like giant oil tankers in the middle of the ocean. Turning them around is hugely difficult. And you talk about the consumers in the global north. Well, these countries have got their own consumers to worry about, right? They need the money to continue to come in.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the case. If we look at the oil-rich Gulf states, the sheikdoms of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, oil and hydrocarbons is still the main source of foreign export earnings. All these countries link their own currencies to the US dollar because that's the primary currency of trade for oil. Disentangling their economies from oil, from gas sales is extremely hard, almost too difficult to even comprehend in the next 10-year period, because these countries are still very high spend in terms of defense spending, in terms of per capita spending on infrastructure. These are some of the most expensive economies in the world. We did a body of research which we launched 2 years ago called the Atlas of Energy Transition, which looked at key markers for energy fundamentals, such as emissions per capita. Some of the biggest emitters in the world are in the Gulf. So, at a very core level, it's very difficult to re-gear these economies away from hydrocarbons, although countries are doing that. And Saudi Arabia is a good example. And the government in Saudi Arabia has made great strides to try.
I think we lost Andrew for a second.
I think he's frozen out.
Yeah.
Andy, can you hear us?
To our viewers, just bear with us. We're working in the world of technology. Sometimes, these dialogues have their own disruptions, just like the energy market. So bear with us for a few seconds. We see if Andy can come back, and if not, okay, I'm sure he's going to tune in. But what a fascinating conversation, Anusha. I mean, the elements that he's touching on about the fact that transition may be accelerated, the fact that, as a matter of fact, many of these decisions are just on a whim based on the next election. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, but energy still is the pivot around which geopolitics turns. That's the critical observation. That for all of our concerns about decarbonization, you still need sources of energy to make the world go round. Unless we change our economic development model, where we don't regulate production through targets, but rather regulate production through need, then this model is going to continue. And if it's nuclear power, if it's wind, solar, whatever, that wave and so on, whatever that comes our way, if we don't change the economic development model, then we're going to continue to use and abuse energy sources.
Couldn't agree more with you. And the other element is that, everybody's stuck on this aspect of what are the price of oil. And, I'm sure everybody will be asking Andy the same question. The funny thing is that the demand is always, in the same plateau, that we forget about that. It's just the supply that is affecting the whole thing. Fascinating in that now.
Absolutely, exactly what he was saying. That actually, there is this marginal gap in production, but it's the demand side. Hopefully we can ask him about how COVID affected, for example, energy markets. But that seems to be where we are in terms of energy. Any sign of him yet?
No, I haven't seen him coming back, but maybe one of us should take a minute and just send him a note. And if you want to do that, I know I can do that. Just to double check. Well, for those of you who are watching, it's important to contextualize that, energy is not just in oil and gas, not only in the way we consume it, but it's the basically crude material, not just the crude oil, in everything we do. And a lot of times we forget about the scale of energy security and the importance and significance of that. Just to contextualize why we're all talking about energy and the importance of energy supplies to Europe, the entire population of Italy roughly is, 62 million, and Shanghai's population is 62 million. So, Italy in one city. So it is significant to understand these needs, strategic pivots, worries about countries. And, when you think about that, Shanghai alone is equal to the population of Italy, and how countries, compete for supply of energy, and why they are worried about it.
Yeah, I call this orbits of energy, actually. I increasingly don't draw a distinction between metropolitans and countries. In fact, I argue that energy is now a resource for cities, and that the world needs to refocus its efforts on city convergence, not on country
to grow up. The world needs to grow up, basically.
Yeah, and change. There are these networks of global cities already that the mayors are like presidents of countries, as you've already mentioned, Ali. With a city of 25 million, 30 million people, you are running a country, and it's those people who run these mega metropolises that need to speak to each other. They are the ones that need to change, if you like, the energy mindset. They are the orbits.
I thought, have you heard from Andy back?
I have. This is a first, guys, and whether it is fortuitous for it to happen today or not, Andy Wright saying that he's got electricity outage.
Well, what an ironic thing to be talking.
Yeah, he's going to try and dial in on his telephone. So if that isn't a marker of our discussions today, I can't imagine.
And I can promise all of you, our viewers, our audience, our wonderful subscribers, and connoisseurs of markets of energy and BRI, this is how do you say, a bit serendipitous that we're talking about energy, and our chief how do you say, wizard, Andrew Critchlow, is running out of electricity in United Kingdom while we're recording a session on BRI dialogues about the world of energy. Unbelievable, Anusha. We couldn't pull this off.
Irony, I don't think would be the right word to capture this. But it just shows our absolute dependence on the flow of electrical currents in our lives, if nothing else, and how easily those can be disrupted. When you look at places like Sri Lanka, who are demanding energy security, and we just kind of look at it and then move on to the next item, you can see how devastating energy security can be. Correct. And the energy deficit can totally devastate livelihoods and communities, and ultimately countries.
Absolutely.
And that no country can afford to risk not having security of energy. And so much of what we do is pivoting, is rotating around this.
So true. Well put.
Crisis.
Let's see where is Anush.
Let's see whether Andy's technology can in fact deliver. Yeah. Whether his phone can do the biz or not, I'm not sure. Yes, Ali. So the AAA is down to 2A.
To 2As at the moment.
AA is still a good thing. There are so many things I wanted to ask Andy, given his expertise and also his networks through which he communicates and corresponds on energy. And I want him to comment.
I hope he comes back. We will wait for him, but I just wrote one of my insanely sane blogs just yesterday, and I wrote that we went from OPEC to OPEC, please pick up the production, and to now, oh shit, we're out of energy. so from OPEC to OPEC, and
so the house has lost power and it's lost Wi-Fi.
Okay.
I mean, this is going to go down in the annals of BRI dialogue.
Absolutely. So what
apologies,
I suggest,
both my house has lost power and Wi-Fi. I cannot seem to be able to get into Zoom via my mobile, Andy.
Well,
so this is one for the record books.
I am not gonna in any form, shape, or fashion deprive ourselves from what Andy has shared with us. I think we should make this Andy take one, Andy take two.
Yeah.
And how amazing it is that Andy, sitting in UK, runs out of electricity, as we said. So to all of you who've been watching, we thank you for joining us. We apologize, but this is just the first time, which is a sign of the changing world order that we are living in and the changing of energy flows that we all need. I want to thank Anush. Always good to see you.
Thank you, Ali.
We will have Andy back soon to pick up the conversation where we left. But in spirit of straight from the guts, no, how do you say? I would say orchestrated dialogues. We will put this out. Enjoy what you get from Andy's insights, and we'll have you back soon.
Absolutely. See you soon, folks. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.